So it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. At every juncture of the juvenile justice system, adults are gatekeepers. From police officers at the front door of the system to judges deciding through which gate young people pass to be rehabilitated. As gatekeepers, we need to determine how to use developmentally appropriate, trauma-informed, racially equitable approach, a 21st century approach. Our next presenter, Greg Gonzalez, will provide an example of what has been done in schools with school resource officers to respond in this new way. But I challenge you to think about how what has been done in schools can be done in our communities. Greg Gonzalez is an Omaha native whose 24-year and counting professional law enforcement career has led him to the deputy chief position of the 900-plus sworn officer Omaha Police Department. He serves on numerous policing and community governing boards. Greg launched his law enforcement career in 1993 with the Douglas County Sheriff's Department, where he worked uniformed patrol and on federal narcotics task force. He transferred to the Omaha Police Department in 1995 and has worked in two of the police department's most high-profile units, the gang unit and the undercover narcotics unit. In addition to attaining a Bachelor's of Science degree in criminal justice and a master's degree in public administration, Greg is an adjunct police academy instructor and has taught over 300 Omaha police recruits command Spanish. Greg is a graduate of the FBI National Academy and the Major City Chiefs of Police Executive Leadership Institute. Greg is also an adjunct instructor at his alma mater, the University of Nebraska at Omaha, where he teaches criminal justice courses. And Greg was recognized by his alma mater as a distinguished alumnus. Can you please help me welcome Greg Gonzalez?
Well, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? My name is Greg Gonzalez. I'm glad to be here. I actually didn't realize there'd be so many people here today. Pretty good crowd here. Nice room, too, by the way. So a little bit about me. Talked a little bit about me already. I think Lisa at the row, if you didn't meet her, she'll get a kick out of this. So after my undergraduate degree at UNO, I became a police officer at 21. So later on, you've heard people talk about the human brain and they develop. I still wonder if police officers should be able to be police officers at 21 if your brain doesn't develop until you're 25. So that's a whole nother issue. But glad to be here this morning. This is kind of a topic that's very important to a lot of people, obviously, with the movement with juvenile justice. Anybody here from Douglas County? So you got one here. It's tough to see. What's your name, sir? Rod. Good. Hey, Rod, how you doing? Anyone else here from Douglas County? Any attorneys here, Douglas County? Any attorneys at all? Who's happy to at least say they're attorney? We love attorneys, right? Cops love attorneys. We can be real dangerous, the police officers, if you're an attorney too. So that's that JD behind my name. I wish I had that too, Lisa. So we do have a couple. So you all kind of appreciate what happens with the juvenile justice system. It's really tough for police officers right now because we have a lot of different varying opinions. Police officers are very opinionated as it comes to individuals, especially if they commit crimes. But for Omaha, we've been through a whole evolution because in 2013, I was promoted to assistant chief. I took a bureau that I really didn't care for because it was more administrative. But part of my responsibilities was we had to oversee the school resource officer program. And then about a month into my position, we hit the newspaper that Omaha Police Department was arresting too many juveniles. And in Omaha, unlike some small municipalities, we have city ordinances, disorderly conduct, which was not popular when you're arresting juveniles at the time. Disorderly conduct, marijuana less than an ounce, and for all the school teachers and administrators in here, you can appreciate that school resource officers in your schools encounter, at least in bigger cities, those offenses quite often, depending on where you're at. Now, we have many different school districts in Douglas County, right? So just like we police every neighborhood a little bit different, people expect different things, it's the same in schools. We have to be very intentional on how our school resource officers act in school. So as we hit the newspaper, it was not fun. And then about 2013, there was a lot more national exposure, I think. At least I could never remember it. I don't know really what the linchpin was, but about 2013, a lot of national exposure to overhauling the juvenile justice system. So I'm going to go ahead and hit my slide here a little bit. All right, so in 2015, there was a group of prosecutors, police officers, I'll call it juvenile justice experts in the field, that applied for a cohort to attend Georgetown University that really studied best practices on juvenile justice. And I happened to be one of them, and we went to Georgetown and really started looking at some of the nuances as it related to juveniles and why juveniles are arrested. So 15 years ago, for law enforcement in the room, in some jurisdictions, if someone gives you the four-letter word and tells you what to do with yourself, you may go to jail. All right? Douglas County is a little bit different because over the years, as policing's evolved, it's not necessarily a crime if I tell you a four-letter expletive that you don't really care for. All right? So it's little things like that that matter, especially in schools when you're dealing with youth, because sometimes that happens. And then when you really start going to Georgetown, we looked at a lot of different things, a lot of different statistics on juveniles, schools, and really dive into what everybody in this room probably knows better than I do. On sometimes why do kids do what they do, all right? And so that was the really neat part about it. I had the opportunity to go to Georgetown, and it's tough because I've worked a murder when I was in homicide. It was a 12-year-old suspect that murdered a kid. And so then you ask the question, was that 12-year-old, did he know what he was doing when he shot and killed somebody, another gang member? And those are those decisions those charging decisions that are tough for law enforcement, for folks in this room to consider as we kind of talk through this today. So goals set by police makers when we looked at these things, and this was a national move to really make young people feel welcome, supported in school. When you talk about threat assessment, for the threat assessment school effort, folks in this room, we want all kids, right? We really preach to tell kids and say hello every day to other kids because we want kids to feel welcome in schools, right? That's first and foremost. We want them to eat. We want people to feel comfortable at schools. We want to close the achievement gap between white students and students of color so they're not disproportionately represented in the criminal justice system, which we hear a lot, and which, not anecdotally, but it happens in some jurisdictions. Why does it happen? Improve high school graduation rates, and we want to reduce the number of youth locked up in the juvenile justice system. So if anybody follows Douglas County, for those that live in Douglas County, we're building a juvenile justice system, and it is not a popular topic right now because you have two factions. You have maybe law enforcement on one side, kind of split, divided, social services on one side, saying, do we really want to build this? How many beds is it going to house? Well, that's kind of a controversial topic of how many beds should it have? How many beds are needed? Currently, we hover right around between 60 and 80 youth that are in the juvenile detention centers. Anybody here from DCYC? So the question always is, how big should it be? And do we let kids out of jail too? Should they be referred to the juvenile justice system more? Is anybody here from intake? Is intake doing their job? Are they letting too many kids out? And so what's an important crime to make sure kids not only referred to the juvenile justice system in the center, but detained? Should they be detained? These are all those hot button issues that continue to they crop up every day in Douglas County. So going to Georgetown, we looked a lot of the evidence of why juveniles and youth are actually not only detained, But what happens when they're detained in school? What happens when there's school disciplinary action against a youth? How does that impact them mentally, physically, with their family? What are the outcomes and the negative outcomes as it relates to graduation rates? A lot of cops don't think about that because that's not what we necessarily signed up for. We don't go through this through the police academy. This isn't something that we really study, but we are now. Now we're looking at it. We're talking about that later how we've evolved. But we look at dropout rates, and this was eye-opening even for me because we're not social workers. Sometimes we have to act as social workers. Sometimes we act as counselors. But we're law enforcement first and foremost, and we're here, right, to do what we have to do and to effectuate an arrest if we have to do that. So Operation Youth Success is one of the movements we had in Douglas County to really look at these school-based arrests, improve collaboration in schools. Once we graduated, our group did from Georgetown, we brought all that nice information back to Douglas County. We started to go to work. A lot of the buzzwords you're going to hear, as you all know, trauma-informed care. What are alternatives to school? Do we have to incarcerate these juveniles? Why do you incarcerate them? Who deserves to be in jail? Who doesn't deserve to be there? Who should be getting help? Is a misdemeanor as a joint word putting somebody in handcuffs and taking them down to the youth center? If you're 16, that used to happen in Douglas County. I promise you it did happen. Until legislation changed, and LB 390, you talked about it. I helped Senator Brooks write that legislation. So it was really friendly for everybody, and it made sense for law enforcement, so we had some statewide training. So school-based arrest task force, a lot of the improved collaboration between schools. We started really looking at even some of our alternative schools and individuals and school resource officers and what was happening in the schools. Blackburn, for example, we put a probation office in Blackburn that wasn't there. That's helped out tremendously because a lot of the student base there were on probation. And so maybe individuals there weren't getting the care that they needed. Maybe they weren't taking their medicine. So who knows their profiles better than police? Some of the folks in this room, the court system, and probation officers. And that kind of helped alleviate a lot of tension between school resource officers, school officials, and those students. So capstone team members, like I talked about, Douglas County Attorney's Office, the juvenile court. We're real fortunate in Douglas County because we have a juvenile court. Some of the jurisdictions you're from probably don't. Hall County might. Anybody here from Hall County? I think Lincoln does. So we work closely with our juvenile county attorney, and that's real nice because we can really dissect those cases for some of the youth that are involved in some crime. So school justice partnership pilot. These were some of the goals, and I could tell you when I took over in 2013, a lot of schools, and this is what's important for school officials in this room, if you have a school resource officer, embrace him or her, because in a lot of school districts, it just wasn't happening. All right? There are a lot of police officers in smaller jurisdictions, they get told to be a school resource officer. Now, for the teachers in this room, how many teachers are in here? I mean, you're a teacher, if you work in schools, you're in social work because you really love the movement, right? You have a passion to work with people and youth to make sure the outcomes are really good. And if you put an individual, police officer in a school doesn't want to be there, is that really a good mix? It's not. It's just not. Especially in light of all the national events that have been happening with police and youth. It's a very delicate topic, and so you have to be careful. And I don't know how many police chiefs are watching, but I think they would probably understand that sometimes maybe you're the low person on totem pole, but you do not want to put a police officer in a school that does not want to be there. I can tell you that that's probably not a great recipe for success. Target population, some of the things that we did in Omaha, and I won't talk everything, I'm just going to go over it real quickly because we could talk all day about some of the things we did in Douglas County, but we really wanted to target our population, look at youth in some of the schools, and why individuals were acting out. Why were students getting in trouble in class and calling their teachers names? Was it because they were bad kids, or was it because they didn't eat that day? Or was it because mom was out all night and brother and sister were kind of taking care of themselves, which has happened, and mom hasn't been home for 3 days, and the one student goes to school, gets in a fight, gets in trouble, a knife is pulled out, and they want to expel the one student that happened to be what I will call victim of circumstances, where mom hadn't been home for 3 days. Should she go to jail? Unless you know the background of it, she's probably going to jail. But those are the things that we learned over time when I get to all the training we did with our police officers. So once we implemented and really got schools to interact with our police officers, and then we were welcome a little bit more in schools with some of the professionals, things started going a little bit smoother. We started having multiple meetings with all our school districts. We started to be embraced by all our superintendents. And we started really looking at safety and not necessarily arresting and detaining juveniles in schools. But that wasn't always easy. Because for some school teachers, I always say, don't say you want to be an inner city school teacher. You know, sometimes you'll hear that, unless you're ready for the inner city problem sometimes. And that means you can't just call the SRO every time something bad happens. Because we've had some school teachers go, hey, this isn't what I signed up for. I didn't sign up to fight kids in school. I didn't sign up to be cussed at. I signed up to teach kids. Well, part of the responsibility of being not only a police officer, but being a teacher is to be able to absorb some of society's, let's call it ill wills of society, and to be able to mentor and cultivate a great atmosphere for these students, for them to succeed in life. And that's exactly what we started doing in Omaha. And it really worked out. And I'm telling you, it was not easy with some police officers to get the mindset change. So with our system, we really started looking at a lot of the data that was happening in schools. Why are individuals not showing up for school? Absenteeism. Are they missing juveniles? Our backlog for missings for students is really high in Douglas County. So we started looking at all these things, and we had experts start looking at why this is happening. Because we all know there's not enough school counselors in school. We wish we had a psychologist at every school. And we probably wish we had a lot more individuals that can really dive into some of the problems that are happening in schools. We just don't have the finances, right? And just like maybe some principals like to have 5 SROs. Can't put 5 SROs in schools, all right? Just can't happen. I have one school resource officer at Omaha South High School with, I think, 2,300 students. You think that school resource officer needs to act tough or better get along with a lot of people, because some of 17-year-old kids are big men and shorter women, right? And you do not want to not be liked with 2,300 students. I can promise you that. And so that's also a lesson to be learned, because there's always going to be someone a little bit tougher. And so that's also kind of that mindset we want police officers to have in schools, to get along with everybody so everybody has a good day and goes home. Core team meetings, I'm not going to touch too much on this, but the point is work together, all right? Law enforcement has to work with probation, parole, whatever it is, social workers, counselors, and likewise, we'd ask you to reciprocate, all right? Whether or not you like police officers, that doesn't matter, all right? What matters is we have the same goal, all right? And if you don't like the police officer necessarily, that's another thing that we change, because when 100,000 students in Douglas County, there are going to be some administrators, people who don't like police officers, all right? We've had principals say, I don't want your police car in front of the apron of the high school. And then we have principals that say, you could have 5 cars there in front of the apron. At the beginning of school, at the end of school, in the middle of school, come in, eat lunch with my kids, I really don't care. So you have to kind of balance that too. We can't take it personal if you don't like police officers, all right? Respect the position, respect kind of what we do, and usually things will get along a little better. So we had to build those relationships too, and I think that's what really is life is all about, building relationships. Core team meeting and practice, a lot of different meetings happen, like I said, with Blackbourne, some of the other inner city schools, and then a whole litany of things that we did that everybody already probably looks at every day on why kids do what they do. You study behaviors, right? It's no different than threat assessment in this world. Why do people do what they do? What triggers students to do what they do? And it always isn't because they don't like cops, right? That's what we learn when you start diving into certain things and you start looking at why some of these students continue to be in the principal's office, all right? We have these situations where we have to really teach police officers, and we had an incident, I can think at Blackburn, where we had a police officer that was told to enforce school conduct. Should we be there to enforce school conduct? Raise your hand if you think that's what our job is in school. I could tell you some teachers probably think we should. And I could tell you that's what got police officers on the front page of the World Herald too before. Because if an individual is sagging, a kid's sagging, does that mean he's a gang member? Who's an expert can tell me that means he or she's a gang member because I'm sagging a little bit, my pants are down? Well, put a belt on, right? So you, principal or someone in school, put a belt on. Calls the SRO. Tell this person to put the belt on. Pull your pants up. Now, if you're having a bad day at home and you're not a gang member, and maybe you got accused of being a gang member, and that's school conduct, who should deal with that? All right? I'm asking anyone that wants to tell me, does this happen? Police officer comes, hey, you need to pull your pants up. I'm not. Yeah, you are. No, I'm not. Pretty soon, you can imagine what happened. It wasn't good. Individual was handcuffed, and he ended up fighting back with police officers and ended up going to the youth center. Now, could that have been prevented? I'll leave that up to you, you know. That's the million-dollar question sometimes in schools on incidents that deal with police officers. And so what really it is what do we do to plan to prevent some of these situations so it doesn't happen? And that's what I'm talking about when we have to educate people and we have to work together. Because if you don't have a plan and then that happens, that could really derail a lot of things for that school for that whole semester, including the police officer could get hurt, teacher could get hurt, a lot of bad things could happen. So talked a little bit about evidence-based principles, looking at best practices with schools. Lisa and some of her folks will talk to you about that. Role of a school resource officer. I want to briefly touch on this because a lot of people don't know what we're supposed to do in schools. School resource officers will tell you, right? We don't necessarily want to be there to be the enforcer. However, when things go sideways, I promise you, you want a police officer close by. I think we could all agree on that. But first and foremost, we should be part of the team as counselor mentors. I have a female police officer that had a student come to her. We solved a double murder in Omaha because that female that came to the female SRO felt comfortable talking to the SRO. Didn't feel comfortable calling 911 or talking to the homicide unit. Felt comfortable because of the relationship that they built together. She was like a mother figure. She's a foster mother, has 8 or 9 children of her own. I mean, you wish sometimes you could replicate folks like that, you know, can clone police officers. And I think life would be a lot better. Unfortunately, we can't, but we solved a double murder for that. And but you're an educator, you're a counselor, and then you're a law enforcement officer, right? Because we're there to teach some classes too. Best practices would say, don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. DARE doesn't work. That's at least what the major city chiefs of police would say that research shows. Some schools still teach great gang resistance training. Chicago PD does. Some would argue if that works right now, maybe in some bigger cities, but some people do teach that. One game I will tell you all to do your best to learn is Jeopardy. We all know what Jeopardy is, right? But Lisa and her folks come up with a really innovative idea just from Jeopardy teaching schools. So now we're trying to incorporate that in schools to start building a relationship with kids. And you can ask questions like, all right, how old do you have to be to carry a firearm? How do you have to be to drink alcohol? Is it okay to not wear a belt in school? You could go over school conduct issues. How old do you have to be to vape? Is it a crime to vape? Because oftentimes, if the kids don't know the expectations and they don't know the law, then you might be having an encounter that you could prevent if at least you can run some games like that. So that's something to talk about. Anyway, in Omaha, we trained all our police officers. We were real fortunate. We have a lot of philanthropic support, Douglas County, and we went to work. We want everybody to be trained. We want everybody to be NASRO certified through National Association of School Resource Officers. We found grants. We sent everybody through advanced training. We sent every police officer, every school resource officer through policing the teen brain in schools. I promise you it'll make you a believer. If you didn't take it, take it. Policing the teen brain for patrol. Most of our Omaha police officers have been through it. All our new recruits go through it. And so it can be a game changer to understand, right, how the human brain works and how developmentally men and women, young adults, start to transition into adulthood, and how things change in their life and their emotions change, and why do their behaviors change, and why do they say things, or why do they do things that we may judge and say, well, you shouldn't do, and that's wrong. So those are the things, and I know that Strategies for Youth will have a psychologist coming. Great. I mean, who better than to have someone in the field that's an expert to talk about that? So that really worked well for police officers in Omaha. Some of those things were incorporated in LB 390. And then legislation. I do all the legislation work for OPD, for the police department, and everybody in this room that works with youth knows that over the last 5 years it's been tough, right, to really follow all the different bills that have been passed or at least brought forward to the Judiciary Committee as they relate to youth. And that could just be something on developing appropriate responses for Miranda warnings to juveniles. And so there's a lot of different things. We could talk all day. I don't want to bore you because I know that it's getting close to lunch, but I could tell you that one good thing that came out of it, everybody's now listening. Because I'm a firm believer, if you want to start making a change, you got to do it when they're younger, right? When they're kiddos. Sometimes it's tough to start to change the behavior of folks when they get too old. So that's exactly what I think everybody in this room probably agrees that we should be doing. So then we started educating our security officers in schools to make sure they're on the same page as us with training, right? Then we started getting school officials as part of the training. Training superintendents, training teachers. Teachers would go do the training and go, this is great training. Geez, I didn't know my school resource officer's name, so now everybody's talking. And that really worked well for us. And so as a result, when you start putting it all together and you start teaching police officers and you start saying, look, this is kind of how we're going to survive in the 21st century as police officers, and if we want to be successful in schools. And we don't want to make the front page again, right? By getting in a fight with a kid at a school and then someone gets hurt, or geez, a police officer, gets hurt. Because we don't want that either. We want police officers to be prepared tactically too, right? So if you're prepared tactically, and tactically in my mind means that you're prepared also to be able to communicate with children of color, children of different cultures, and understand that you can't get mad because a juvenile is not looking you in the eye, because we're all different. And you can't get mad and you go, look at me, son, like you're talking to your own kid. Because culturally, there are different things we have to learn about people and about youth. And so and this is a team effort, our referrals to the juvenile court system, and it used to be arrest, right, at 16, have dropped dramatically. And part of it is we started looking at contracts and agreements with schools and go, we also don't want to put hands on a lot of youth, all right? But don't put us in a bad spot where we have to. So when I talk about code of conduct, and we've had some great superintendents that kind of see the vision, they started putting security officers to work. Sorry for those, it's great that you want to be a security officer, and I really appreciate that you want to come back. Maybe you're a retired teacher and you want to go be a security officer at school, but guess what? Sometimes that means you have to be out, like police officers, talking to kids. And sometimes that means you have to help us do our job, because if we get there first and you just rely on us, sometimes that uniform and a bad day just is not a great recipe in some of the schools. But with the help of the school resource officers, the help of the counselors, it's just a nice fit when everybody's on the same page. Our misdemeanor arrests have went down dramatically. This is the good work of all the police officers that really, and the school officials, and Lisa and her team, and all the people that work together to make sure that we knew and understood. We're not telling police officers I want to make it real clear, when to make an arrest. I tell all my school resource officers. But be accountable for every detention, and every time you put handcuffs on a youth, you're going to be held accountable for it. Because every time that they do, they're forced to send emails that go up the chain, and I get it, and I read them. I read every one. And then if there's something in that email that makes me that's a little unnerving, then we're going to talk about it. And we've never had a high turnover rate. The school resources that come to work to be a school resource officer, and I tell them, I'm real honest with them, the buck stops with me, because if something bad happens, then I have to answer to my boss, the chief of police, right? So I told everybody even the other day, as we start to ramp up to get back to school on our public school system, and we have a refresher on the George Floyd incident. We talk about some use of force changes, and I tell everybody to be very intentional and understand the dynamics that come with COVID and how it changed us, right, as adults, and how the things that we don't like to do because of COVID, and then think of all the friends that you know that are unemployed, that had good jobs, maybe don't have insurance, maybe in the food line. And I've seen many nice cars. Every morning I drive downtown Leavenworth Street to the central headquarters of people, row of cars up to 40 in line to get a box of free food. So when I tell them to be ready for school and to be mindful that when dealing with youth, when you go to school, to make sure you don't make it a worse day for the kids that show up for school. And life will generally be a lot better if you understand why people do what they do. I'm going to kind of buzz through some of this because we just talked about it. School to prison pipeline, that is a term sometimes it is not necessarily digested really well at law enforcement, all right, or some officials. But let's just talk about it for a second and say what we're doing in schools is most of the individuals I would like to think nationally that are school resource officers want to be there, right? And most don't want to arrest a juvenile. It's a lot of paperwork. Some get frustrated maybe because they're going through the juvenile system if they're referred. And so for us, we want to make sure that if we do that individual is going to also get some help that's much needed. And we've also had the same kind of retort from juvenile county attorneys go, well, if they're in the system, they get services. So sometimes it's not a bad idea to necessarily get that youth in the system, because maybe then they get state services. Lisa, I don't know if you'd agree with that, but that's kind of some of those things that we talk about on. But if the schools, right, have counselors and psychologists and resources, that's a game changer. To have resources available for youth when needed. And we could talk a lot about some of the crimes. I'm not telling any police officer when to make an arrest. I'm not telling you what to do. We're just telling you a little bit about what we did in Douglas County with over 100,000 students, getting everybody on the same page to work together to make sure that we're in unison as we move forward. And I could tell you every superintendent knows their school resource officer, because we've had meetings, I have, with all the superintendents and administrators where we've had feedback, good and bad, about our school resource officers. How am I doing on time? All right, so I'm going to I'm going to start wrapping it up because I know there might be some questions, and kind of see what the audience says for some of the what you have on your mind.
I would just like to respond to your last question, which I was going to respond to before even you asked it. I'm Lisa Thoreau, and we trained the Omaha Police Department back in 2016 on policing the teen brain in school. And then later we have been working for the last 4 years doing patrol officer training and bringing our Jeopardy games. And one of the Jeopardy games that Greg referred to is teaching the school code of conduct to kids. Because one of our expectations, I guess, as adults is that everybody knows the rule or that anybody reads the school code of conduct as a parent, and neither is true. As a parent, I can tell you certainly the latter is not true. And we know that not all kids know the rules. But the point of arresting a child to get them services deserves special attention, as does the policy decisions that led to having police in schools to support order. Both of those are policy decisions. They are not necessary default approaches. It is a policy decision to fund police over school psychologists and guidance counselors. I believe in Omaha, it's the Sherwood Foundation that put social workers in the public schools and paid for that, and the city paid for school police. In some places, there's more money for guidance counselors and school psychologists, and police are deployed to schools solely on an on-call basis as needed. The assumption that we hear across America that if you arrest a kid, they'll get services is no longer accurate, and frankly hasn't been for a long time. It is not always the case that the court systems can offer the services that kids want. It certainly can't offer detention the way it wanted to now that we have COVID. And secondly, the trauma involved in being arrested may be a wake-up call to some kids, but may just send others further down that rabbit hole of being labeled a delinquent and remaining system involved. So again, we have to remember that the philosophy that determines, as the commissioner just said, Commissioner Blomstedt just said, is key to all our responses. And if we don't have agreement on that, then we have some of the unfortunate outcomes we can see. So I agree with Greg. The complexity of imposing this is manifest when you have teachers wanting to arrest the kids left and right, school principals not wanting it, superintendents being torn between parents wanting police in schools and parents not wanting police in schools, and then the data and the studies showing what some of the racialized impacts are. This is a very difficult water to navigate, and we'd be happy to talk about it in greater detail on another conference maybe, but this assumption that police can fix some of these problems through referral to the systems is not accurate, and it is not de facto the case that you need to have SROs. You can have them in lieu of school psychologists, but that's a choice you're making. That's a choice as a school system or a city.
Over the last couple of years, youth are being pushed to the adult probation side of things, which adult probation does not have the funding that would allow for services for these youth, and youth are still youth, you know, regardless of them being put in the adult probation system. That tends to be a problem, especially for me, who work with youth. Some of the youth are being placed on adult probation simply because of their gang involvement, or, you know, they were in a car with a gun and no one claimed this gun. But these kids still need to be provided the opportunity for services. And like I said, over the last couple of years, those numbers have tripled, where we have more youth who are being placed in the adult probation side of things.
That's a good point, too.
I have a question for you from someone watching online out of Hall County. The question is, how do you suggest students' constitutional rights be maintained and protected with school resource officers interviewing students without Miranda warnings, without audio or video recordings of the interview to know what was actually said?
That's a good question, and that actually came up during legislation. So I would tell that individual that every department's a little bit different, every police department, and every situation's a little bit different. For example, if we had a case where there might be incest or an allegation of incest or abuse, neglect, we're certainly going to be very, very intentional on who's going to be part of that interview. However, juveniles and school officials have been kind of under the impression, and some schools have asked for it, that if we're going to have the Detective Bureau interrogate or do a formal interview with a juvenile, they can certainly ask to have their parents present during the interview. Not saying that police department will allow that, but some of the things that we've talked about, but we've actually even changed our juvenile. The Omaha Police Department has a juvenile rights advisory forum. So the language is very intentional, at least if they're going to do it. You still have to overcome the court system and prudent people and judge and attorneys to understand if a juvenile can make that waiver voluntarily. And so at least I would suggest that you have maybe consider a juvenile rights advisory forum. There's appropriate language for that and the juvenile to understand.